Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to the first impressions video on Xianyun. And so far, I am quite enjoying this unit. I think that her teams are pretty fun to play. Now, I'm sure the novelty will wear off eventually, and, you know, it'll just be one team like many others. But at the very least, for now, I am enjoying the playstyle. But yeah, so let's just get right into what I think about her. Right now, I have her at level 70 out of 70, balance 116, because when it comes to her damage, her personal damage is really, really bad with this. Like, it's not very good, so it doesn't matter that much. Most of the damage that you get from her being on your team is obviously the fact that you're plunging, but also this, which doesn't scale that incredibly well with her levels, because the only thing that's going to scale with her level is her attack percent ascension and her flat attack base stat, but the difference between level 70 and 90 isn't that big, so this is more or less the power that you're gonna have with a level 90 Xianyun. The healing is going to be noticeably a little bit weaker, but it's still not gonna be that bad. Like, she still heals enough with this. If anything, the biggest issue I've had so far is that 15k HP. When you're standing in a Bennett burst against the Tulpa, you die. Especially with 400 defense. But that's gonna obviously be solved once I get her properly leveled. But yeah, so I've mostly looked at the stuff that I was expecting to be good. I've looked at Hu Tao teams, I've looked at Bennett Carry teams, I've looked at just random plus Bennett Xianyun Furina teams, I've looked at Xiao teams, and everything seems to perform more or less as I expected, with one, I guess, caveat, which is that her Pyro Swirl setups seem to be a bit easier than I expected them to be. But the default setups, I think, or the ones that I had looked at before release, are still pretty much the same in terms of like how tight they are. But the base setup, right, that people usually use with units like Kazuha to get a Pyro Swirl in a team with Furina and Bennett, is they do Furina EQ into Bennett Q, E, into quickly swap to Kazuha and use his E. Right, the usual setup, Furina EQ, Bennett QE, Kazuha E. I missed it. It's very easy to miss it, as showcased by me f***ing missing it. If anything, this helps show that it is indeed something that is very easy to miss. Now, this is with like low ping. With high ping, it's just not possible to do this specific setup, because it relies on being able to swap to Kazuha quickly before your Pyro Aura disappears, and ping delays swap timers. Something that you can do with C6 Bennett in order to make this setup a lot easier is the same start, but instead of swapping, you stay on Bennett and then you attack. And then you have a pretty large window. You use Bennett C6 Pyro Infusion to reapply Pyro after you've lost it, right? Instead of trying to swap to Kazuha before you lose it, you let yourself lose it and then reapply it. And that's the main reason why I talked, specifically in the Gumming pre-release, about how having Bennett C6 makes setups with Xianyun a lot easier. And then when you are using Xianyun, you can do something relatively similar by using her normal attack instead of Kazuha's E, because it comes out relatively quickly. And by doing Furina QE into Xianyun Burst into Bennett, because Xianyun's Burst lasts around the same time as Furina Burst, and so you effectively have around the same buffer between your Furina skill and when you need to swirl. However, as it turns out, you don't need C6 Bennett. Because Bennett's hold E can do the same thing. Now, if you don't have C4 Bennett, it can be relatively hard to time it so that your first hit happens before the Hydro hit, and that the second hit happens after the Hydro hit. But once you have C4, even if you do it a little bit too early, you can just use the C4, slam down, and you'll be fine. Alright, so even if you do it a little bit too early, I guess I didn't do it too early. But you just use a C4 and slam down, and you get your Pyro up that you need. Which makes it so that her setups are a bit less reliant on Bennett C6, which is very nice for her teams with Gumming. That's like the main thing that I thought I should mention, because I think it's the main thing that I guess underestimated about her. But yeah, so for the rest, I think overall, you should be a little bit careful just looking at the numbers, because when you are looking at these teams, basically all of your damage is coming from those plunges. So the damage numbers, they're going to be your whole rotation's damage. It's easier to realize how much damage you're doing when all of your damage is added together for you and it's just shown to you as one number. And so it feels like you're doing more damage even if you're doing the same. That's not to say her teams aren't good. It's just to say that visually they will look a little bit better than they actually are. With all of that being said, I will leave you guys with some footage of my testing, and I will meet you guys back here for the outro to this video. Put up at the end. So I need to level Dehya's normal attacks for this team. I've been ahead of you. I've been ready for this since she dropped. Okay? I think I got it there. Yeah, pretty good. Things went right. Huge. Please be nice to me. Ah, whatever. Well, it decided to be cringe, but we're fine. It cringed us a little bit, but that's okay. I'm just not gonna E, whatever, man. Oops. Right, so like, yeah. This is definitely, so far, the team that feels the best. Definitely feels better than the other Xiao teams I've played. Lets me avoid the cringe of non-C6 Farazan. Very happy with that. Whatever, I'm just not gonna E. No! I have Fav for a reason. If I can't use the Fav, then this game sucks. Alright. Yeah. Definitely makes it feel a lot better. Oh, we didn't reach 100k, Saj. Vape Xiao? Oh god. I'm not sure this is ethical, so please close your eyes. Can you do that for me?
Time to shine. Make way, everybody stand back.
Oh. Why is it better than using his first? No! No!
Lightning, echoing sound. Seize the skies. Teamwork is tricky.
Okay, we're losing our vase because he f***ing... This is actually just unlucky, though. Like, that's straight up just unlucky. He f***ing dodged our Hydro app, so it f***ed over our setup. Like, part of me seeing this, and is like, so f***ing pippi-lying. Like, what is this? Why did I just plunge for 140k? Okay, we finished in the middle of a rotation, so gonna have to do a little bit of cringing, but there we go.
Cascade, mind the danger.
Time to shine. Stray cloud converge. Teamwork is dreamwork.
Be still. Kamisato on. Suyu.
Lightning, echoing
I'm not gonna use my
Make way.
my E this time.
Attempt back.
Let the world collide. Let's light it up.
Yeah, I don't wanna finish without ults. I'm actually gonna try to beat the Tulpa with this.
Cascade, mind the danger.
Strike a pose. Time to shine. Seize the skies. Everybody stand back. Showing you.
Hmm.
Stray cloud converge. Teamwork is
The plan.
Maybe the Tulpa is not a good idea. Hello, this is Zajef from the following day. I've done a little bit more testing, and I just wanted to add a few things, mainly because I've come to realize that a lot of people haven't watched my pre-release, and I didn't focus too much on the negative things in the first impressions video that I was already expecting, because I went into it expecting them, so they didn't surprise me, so I didn't spend too much time on it. And I want to just make sure I actually mention them so that you don't end up rolling for a unit that you don't enjoy. First, plunge attacks. While they do have AoE, a lot of them, the AoE is centered around the character, not in front of the character, which can make it hard to actually hit a lot of different targets. And just the AoE is not that big to begin with either. So when you're looking at AoE content, it's very likely that your plunges aren't going to be hitting an AoE when you're not playing a character like Xiao or gumming with his C6, who have ways of increasing the AoE of their plunge attack. Next is the setups. I've talked a decent amount about the setups, but at the end of the day, setups can be cringe to do, and more importantly, some enemies just don't let you do setups properly. I mean, I don't know how much of it is going to be in the actual video, probably not too much of it, because video is supposed to focus on me actually playing, not me pressing the retry button. But there's a lot of times when I was doing my setups where PMA, who's a very good example of an enemy that moves a decent amount, the perpetual mechanical array would just do one of its attack that makes it move, which would make it either out of range of my abilities, or it would make me miss an ability, or when it goes up in the air, it changes the timing at which Furina's summons attack, which changes the timing for your setups. Point being, there can be a lot of minor things that will actually, in a really significant way, affect how easy or hard it is to do your setups. I think that's part of why I tend to like the Bennett team so much, because in the Bennett team, I'm not even doing a setup. I don't think it's really worth wasting your Bennett uptime for a setup, because Bennett is your carry, so like you're already on your carry, you don't really want to swap out once you use his burst. So I've just been doing no Pyro Swirl for him, and that's what I was expecting, that's what I was planning on doing. But the fact that you can do that just makes it a lot more impervious to enemies fucking you over, basically. That's something that can apply to Hu Tao as well, and Xiao. This cringe that I'm talking about, it mostly applies to the characters that you put into the Bennett, Xianyun, Furina core, and just plunge attack with their infused attacks. And speaking of that, another thing that I was very much expecting and that I covered in the pre-release, but that I want to mention again for those people who didn't watch the pre-release, is that at the end of the day, Furina makes a pretty big difference in terms of how good Xianyun is. What Xianyun provides is good, but every anemo unit is going to provide something good. At least the good ones, right? Like you look at Sucrose, you look at Kazuha. These are units that provide a lot to the teams. And in order for Xianyun to be able to really earn her place, in most situations, it's not really enough to just let you plunge and buff plunges. And she's very much balanced around the fact that her healing enables getting a lot of fanfare on Furina. While teams that don't use Furina are still very playable, they do tend to be worse in most situations, which is definitely something that, I mean, if you don't have Furina, you're not going to be able to see the exact same results as people who do, which might make you end up want to skipping her. And a somewhat similar thing can be said for Bennett C6. Now, Bennett C6 doesn't matter for every character. I've already talked about in this video how you can still do some less ping dependent setups without the C6 by either using a C4 or just timing level 1 hold E properly. But if your character doesn't have a pyro or doesn't have an infusion, it's doing a lot. And I think there are characters that don't need it. I mean, obviously Xiao doesn't even really want to use Bennett if you have C6 Farazan. If you don't have C6 Farazan, I think it's like, right? Like if you're Farazan C0, it's like it's really fine to use either. But when it comes to characters like Diluc's burst is very, very long, and compared to the damage that his plunges are doing, isn't something you want to be using if you could be plunging instead, which means that not having Bennett C6 will hurt his damage because he's gonna have to use burst instead of being able to just ignore it altogether. Characters like Ga Ming do just benefit from it a lot. There are characters that don't benefit from it, but honestly, when it comes to the teams where you're mainly focusing on your plunge attacks, I think that outside of the Xiao and the Hu Tao one, the ones that don't rely on Bennett C6 don't tend to be all that great. Now, there are teams where you're not focusing on the plunge attack. So for example, if you're using her in an Aggravate team just because she's an anemo healer, and honestly, that works. She's not insane. She's very, very replaceable with Jean, but as I mentioned in my pre-release, what you're effectively doing with her is you're spending a little bit more time on your healer in order to unlock the ability to dodge by jumping, which is actually very useful in some situations. I think it's very easy to notice how helpful jumps can be, specifically against Lava Charles, because Lava Charles have very telegraphed attacks that hit very hard if you don't iframe them properly, but if you just jump, they don't hit you, apart from the like rock throw attack. But it's very easy to notice how helpful jumping can be against those enemies. It's not like a wow, insane big deal, but it is a nice little helpful added layer of defensive utility, on top of the fact that plunges are generally a slight increase to your damage in those teams. The reason why they're not as big of an increase to your damage in those Aggravate teams as they are in the Vape and Melt teams is because the way that the Aggravate reaction works is it just adds a number to what you're already doing, and the number that gets added doesn't look at the number you were already doing. So in other words, if I trigger Aggravate on Kutsing's stiletto damage, I gain the same amount of damage as when I trigger it from the slashing damage on the E. It just gets added onto it. Vape, on the other hand, multiplies the actual damage number that you're doing, which makes it so that increasing that initial number, like Xianyun does with this, right? Increasing that number, this 200% of her attack can also vape. It's like you're getting a vape on this on top of a vape on the initial attack. Whereas with Aggravate, you're getting an Aggravate on the initial attack, but nothing on this, because it's not a separate hit. That makes it so that you can gain a lot, because not only are you getting the multiplier from the fact that you're triggering a reaction, but also, and this is something that you're going to notice when you look at how you build characters with Xianyun, you get to build EM, and we'll get to that in a second, don't you worry. You get to build EM instead of attack on your sands. When you just look at straight up the plunge damage, EM and attack tend to be relatively similar, but attack on Neuvillette, if he's plunging, doesn't increase Xianyun's portion of the damage. It just increases his portion, this 281. Whereas EM, on the other hand, does increase this 281, but also Xianyun's 200%. In other words, the damage that you gain from Xianyun is significantly higher on Vape and Meld teams than it is on other teams. You're getting 200% of her attack, and let's say she's at 3000 attack. Pretty round, pretty simple, right? So attack, motion value. Then you have your character's crit rate, crit damage, crit multiplier. You have their damage percent, and then you have their EM multiplier, and the overall damage. So let's say you have a character that has 70% crit rate, 140% crit damage. If you're playing with Furina, you can have a lot more, obviously, because you're getting Maréchaussée. Let's look at 80%, 160%. You have a Goblet, you have Furina, Bennett C6 if you're using that, 15%. We'll keep it simple for this, right? If you're getting, you're getting an EM Sands, you're actually building some EM in your substats, you can end up with somewhere between 200 and 300 EM. Let's do 250 for now. Your damage is going to be your attack, multiplied by motion value, multiplied by crit multiplier, multiplied by 1 plus damage percent, multiplied by if vape, 1.5, multiplied by multiplier, otherwise 1. Multiplied by 190 divided by 390, multiplied by 0.9. So for now, let's just assume no VV, right? Which means that the amount when you're not vaping, right? Or when you are vaping, even though vape only increases your damage by 50%, the amount of damage that you gain from Xianyun is increased by 113% rather than just 50% with these assumptions. Now, that's generally gonna vary somewhere between 80 and 150, depending on how many external buffs you have. But the point is, you can get a lot more damage from your Xianyun when you're vaping or melting the plunges than when you're not. Which is part of why the teams that actually synergize with her plunges tend to be the ones that are vape or melt. You have effectively 3 ways of doing vape or melt teams. I guess 4 ways. You can do a pyro unit that's either vape or melting. You can use a hydro unit that's vaping, or you can use a cryo unit that's melting. But I would say that the cryo and the hydro units end up really behaving in very similar ways. So what I mean by that is the pyro units, generally they're either trying to get a hydro unit with something like Furina ideally, or you're doing some melt stuff with a unit like Rosario. Whereas the cryo and hydro units, they all just need off-field pyro app, which generally is just gonna be Xiangling. Which means that out of those teams, the general cores are gonna be Bennett, Xianyun, Xiangling, and Bennett, Xianyun, Furina, and Bennett, Xianyun, cryo. And then the cryo can be Rosaria, can be Ganyu. We still don't have like the greatest options for cryo. You can use Kea, it just doesn't last that long, so it's not that insane, but it does apply faster, so it's like, You can use Lila as well, yeah. But yeah, these teams, they don't tend to rely on Bennett C6 at all, because you're using a cryo or a hydro unit as your last slot. I don't think there's any that are that great so far. They're fine, and like that's why my Neuvillette is currently on an attack build, right? That's what I was doing with him. And it's funny, don't get me wrong, but it's not like amazing. It's just it's a funny team. You end up losing a lot of the upsides that you have on Neuvillette when it comes to stuff outside of just straight up damage, right? A lot of his comfort, a lot of his utility ends up being lost when you're playing these teams. But it is actually good enough to clear Abyss. And then you can do the same thing with Barbara, with Kanaka if you really want. You can do it with Mona, but Mona's dashes are very cringe. They slow her down a lot, so it can be a bit harder to play and just not quite as good. But yeah, outside of that, you can also do a similar core with cryo units. And unfortunately, I just don't think they tend to be as good. Mainly just because, well, those cryo units are multiplying by 1.5 instead of 2. And with Xianyun as your off-field pyro app, you don't run out of pyro. You don't run out of pyro, so the fact that you're consuming less aura with cryo doesn't really give you anything like it does for the general on-field pyro units with hydro stuff. Eventually, just because plunge attacks don't come out that quickly, right? So they're not going to overtake your aura too easily. And then you have the Bennett Furina and the Bennett Cryo. I think Bennett Cryo is generally not great. It might be a pretty good speedrun strat, and it's probably a fine thing to do if you don't have Furina. I haven't really found any teams so far that I really like with that. Most of the teams that I've liked with her are Bennett, Xianyun, Furina. And then finally, other teams where you just want an anemo healer outside of Aggravate. You also have like freeze teams. You can use her with Risley. It works. You can effectively like do, I think the combo people were looking at was N3C JP. When you use your charge attack, you jump cancel it into a plunge attack, and it's like fine. Like it doesn't add an insane amount, but it is nice. So it's all right. But yeah, that's basically it. So I'll leave you guys with yesterday's Zajef for the rest of the video. Bye. Welcome back! As you may have noticed, there's still a few things I haven't tested. I haven't tested Diluc. I haven't tested just a few more of the characters, like Xianyun, for example. The reality is they're not going to be meaningfully different from characters like Dehya. Well-invested Diluc will be, you know, decently stronger than Dehya because he just has better multipliers for his plunge stuff. But all in all, it's relatively easy to extrapolate from the characters that I did test for those characters I haven't tested. There's still some characters I want to do some more testing on, but I've been awake for a pretty long time, and so I'm probably going to resume my testing tomorrow. Any further conclusions are going to be present in the post-release, so you can, you know, subscribe if you want to see that. I haven't tested Yai or any of the Quicken teams yet, which is something I'll want to get into. Risley as well is something I'm going to want to test. Maybe something with Klee. We'll see about all of that. For those of you who missed it in the clips, Raiden, yeah, it appears that the A4 does indeed not work with Raiden, which makes her, well, not a completely useless option, definitely not a premium one for Raiden's teams. But yeah, that's going to be it, really. So far, so good. Pretty strong character, mostly in line with my expectations so far, and is going to definitely make all of those like just pretty shitty characters that don't feel very good to play feel a lot better when you run them in teams with her and Furina and Bennett C6. I don't think I'm going to make a day one first impression video on Gumming, but I will make a post-release, so you can also stick around for that. Maybe we will make a day two first impressions on Gumming. I don't know, we'll see. Anyways, bye YouTube.